O dabar į sceną noriu pakviesti dar vieną garbingą transporto inovacijų forumo
And
svečią.
now I'm inviting
Tarptautinės
one more
energetikos
guest,
agentūros vyriausiąjį energetinių technologijų vadovą Timur Gyul. Jis prie
Timur
Tarptautinės energetikos agentūros
Gyul.
prisijungė dar 2009-aisiais. Šiuo metu Timur kartu su savo komanda tyria pažangės švariosios
Now Timur,
energetikos
together with
technologijas
his team,
ir
is
analizuoja jų
working on
tiekimo
the
grandinės
innovations,
įvairiuose
green
sektoriuose.
technologies,
Jis taip pat yra energetikos
and
technologijų
is
politikos
also Chief
skyriaus
Energy
vadovas
Technology
atsakingas už
Officer
Tarptautinės
at
energetikos agentūros
International Energy
svarbiausius technologijų
Agency.
leidinius ir tarptautinių bendradarbiavimų technologijų srityje vystymą. Pasitikite.
So, good morning, Minister, Excellencies, distinguished guests. It's a great honor for me to be here with you today as well, after this excellent presentation from my colleague Frank from the OECD, to speak about technology opportunities for decarbonizing the transport sector against the backdrop of the changes that are underway in the way we are producing and consuming energy, and in view of the climate goals that we are all working to achieve. To start with, let me point out that it is very important to recognize that the energy world is changing. It is changing over the last couple of years already, and with the policies that are being implemented in many countries around the world, with the market and technology trends that we are seeing across the world, the changes that are underway today are going to change the energy world for decades to come, even only with the policies that are already in place today. Let me give you 3 examples of changes that are very important here. The first one is really about clean energy technologies, and what I mean here is in particular electric cars, as well as solar photovoltaic, solar PV. In 2020, just 3 years ago, electric vehicles accounted for 1 in every 25 cars that were sold around the world today. This year, our expectation is that this number grows to 1 in every 5 cars that are being sold around the world today. The exponential growth of electric vehicle sales is set to continue, according to our analysis, on the basis of existing policies alone, reaching at least half of the sales in the 3 major car markets around the world: China, the European Union, and the United States by the year 2030. Solar photovoltaic has become a huge industry. You all know the growth stories that we've been experiencing over the last few years, but today what we are seeing is that invested capital in global solar PV manufacturing is now 1/4 as much as invested capital in the global automotive manufacturing industry. So it's a huge industry. This is no longer a niche product for the purpose of climate change, etc., but it's a huge industrial opportunity. Solar PV and wind energy are now set to overtake coal to become the largest source of electricity generation worldwide before the year 2030. Again, just on the basis of the policies that have been implemented to date. Another, and that's the third force that I would like to bring to your attention, that is shaping the outlook for the way we produce and consume energy, is the slowdown and rebalancing of the Chinese economy as the Chinese government pursues what they call high-quality development. The working age population has peaked in China, cement production has peaked, and steel production is at or very close, at least, to the peak of production. We therefore see China's economic growth slowing down and rebalancing, with major implications for the global energy sector. Why are these changes in China so important? It is very simple, in fact. Between 2012 and 2022, so over the last 10 years roughly, China has been responsible for roughly half of global energy demand growth. It was by far the most dominant player in global coal markets, as you see on the left-hand side. It was responsible for 2/3 of global oil demand growth and 1/3 of global gas demand growth. So whatever happens in China has huge implications for the rest of the world. China's growth has surprised the energy world once already over the last 2 decades. But now its economy and energy sector are changing, and we should not be surprised again. This is happening all again already under existing policies. As a result of the growth in renewable energy and nuclear power in the electricity sector, we believe coal demand in China is set to peak in the next few years and then decline. For oil, it's important that electric vehicles already account for roughly 1/3 of car sales in China. The number of conventional cars on the road in China, according to our projections, is set to peak before 2030, leading to a peak in China's oil demand already this decade. And for China, the gas demand is set to continue to grow over the next couple of decades on the basis of existing policies, but much more slowly than what we have seen in the past decade. If you now look at other countries around the world, and starting with advanced economies, industrialized countries, where it's important to keep in mind that energy demand has already saturated in these countries as a whole. The decline of coal demand is set to accelerate under existing policies. Oil demand in advanced economies has already peaked back in 2005, and its decline is more pronounced in the coming decades. For gas demand, the growth of renewables in power and heat pumps in buildings will start to make its dent into gas demand in these countries. Of course, the picture in emerging and developing economies other than China is very different from what's going on in advanced economies and in China. Of course, because energy consumption per capita today is very low in these countries. Coal is set to continue to grow, driven by countries such as India, where energy needs are still very large. Oil continues to grow with growing population and vehicle ownership in countries such as Southeast Asia and in India. And natural gas demand is driven particularly by the Middle East, but also by Africa, where it supports sectors like industry and fertilizer production. But whatever way you look at it, and of course the world is very different, every country is very different, status of development, status of energy consumption per capita, etc. But when you aggregate everything up, and this is again just under existing policies, it's important to recognize that the regional trends altogether are set to lead to a peak for each of the fossil fuels before 2030, without any additional climate policies or whatsoever put in place. These are the trends that we are observing on the basis of existing policies. And of course, policies will change. Policies are implemented every year in every country around the world, not only to address climate change anymore, but also because the opportunity clean energy technologies offer have now become a matter of industrial and economic policies. Countries as well as industries are racing to secure their place in the new clean energy economy that is emerging. And so we believe that even though the path to 1.5 degrees, the climate goal that we've all subscribed to, is narrowing, clean energy growth still keeps it open. So there are many reasons to be optimistic on changes in the energy sector towards lower carbon fuels, but another important reason to be optimistic on the clean energy transition is actually progress on innovation, which is a key topic of today. 2 years ago, the IEA released what is now quite famous roadmap called Net Zero by 2050 for the very first time. We showed at the time that almost half of the emission savings that we need to achieve in order to reach net zero emissions by the year 2050 and reach the 1.5 degrees goal, almost half of the emission savings need to come from technologies that are today not yet in the market. So they are at demonstration or at prototype stage. This is not about technology miracles. We can't wait for a technology miracle to protect our climate, but this is about bringing the technologies like certain battery types, technologies in heavy industry, in shipping and aviation to the market which are still today at demonstration or prototype stage. At the IEA, we are tracking progress for more than 550 different clean energy technologies worldwide. What is their status of development? What are their performance objectives, costs, etc., etc. which allows us to reflect very, very closely on technology progress. And the good news here that is coming from that work is that in our assessment, in our update that we just made in September a couple of weeks ago, is that the share of emission reductions in 2050 that needs to come from technologies that are still under development today decreased from what was almost half 2 years ago to 35%. There are two factors that underpin this change. One is the one that I already mentioned, that the market for clean energy technologies is changing very quickly, and so we have made updates with recent investment trends and announcements from technology manufacturers. But just as important is that there has been considerable progress on clean energy innovation, including commercialization of several technologies. Think of sodium-ion batteries as one key example, a technology that was at prototype stage only 2 years ago in 2021, and is now making its first market entry. Such battery chemistry does not require any critical minerals, and so this is an important step to manage security risks of the net zero transition. The progress that we're seeing on clean energy technologies and the way they are turning into massive industrial opportunity turns the policy focus, in our observation, increasingly on the supply chains of these clean energy technologies. And these supply chains today are heavily geographically concentrated. Why is this of a concern? It is very obvious, I think. It is a concern because concentration at any point in a supply chain, and for any supply chain, is always a risk. It makes the entire supply chain vulnerable to incidents, whether they're related to natural disasters, technical failures, to individual countries' policy choices, or to a company's decision. In the case of clean energy technologies, we typically think of concentration risks when it comes to the mining of the mining sector, the mining of critical minerals, and this is right. This is right because, for example, the top 3 producer countries for selected critical minerals account for around 80% of global production in the case of cobalt, 90% for lithium, and around 45% for copper. But concentration in clean energy technologies is not limited to mining alone. As you move further downstream in supply chains, we can see very high degrees of concentration as well. Minerals must, of course, be processed and refined before they can become materials that can be used, and such activity shows very high levels of geographical concentration today as well. Bulk materials, such as steel and aluminium, are very important for producing clean energy technologies, to produce electric cars, wind turbines, etc. Such materials are produced at scales that are orders of magnitude higher than critical minerals, and they are mature market, but nonetheless, we see high levels of geographical concentration there as well. But what is important here is that the manufacturing for the new and emerging clean energy technologies is very, very geographical concentrated. More than 70% of production capacity and up to 85% is held by the top 3 producer countries for batteries, for onshore wind, for solar PV, for heat pump, for electrolyzers, everything that everyone is looking at these days. And when you look at the largest individual producer, you can see that China plays an outsized role virtually everywhere, with the one exception being mining, where it's not a policy choice that you take as a country, but it's resource endowment, first and foremost, that puts your place in the supply chain in this regard. But for any other step, China is the largest producing country today and is likely to remain so for years to come. For some of the key components of solar PV and batteries, for example, China today has already large excess capacity and operates at very low utilization rates. Now, I have spoken at length about energy matters, but what is important here today is, of course, transport. And so let me gradually move into this particular topic and the role of technology and innovation. There has been much progress, I already said it, around electric cars, but regrettably not so much beyond, if we are perfectly honest with ourselves. If you look at the last 2 decades and the time before the pandemic, then transport emission grew by around 2% per year until 2019, reaching more than 8 gigatons of CO2 by that year. There was a drop, of course, by around 15% in emissions in the year 2020 as a result of the global pandemic, and they have yet to fully rebound, even though we are seeing them very much on track in 2023 to come close to the levels of 2019. The turnaround that we need to achieve in the transport sector is massive. If you want to the transport sector to play its role in reaching the 1.5 degrees goal. CO2 emissions must fall by around 90% to 2050 for the transport sector to make its contribution. Road transport emissions are obviously key here. You see this from a picture of today. They represent over 3/4 of total transport emissions globally today. But the good news here is that the technology in many ways is more ready, if you want, for significant levels of decarbonization. To reach net zero by 2050, according to our roadmap, according to our scenario, conventional ICE vehicle sales are phased out by 2035 for cars and vans, and by 2045 for heavy trucks. So this is the kind of deployment challenge, first and foremost, that we're seeing in this sector. The situation is somewhat different for shipping and aviation, where the main technology solutions for the full decarbonization of shipping and aviation are not yet ready for the market. So naturally, it will be challenging for them to be fully emission-free by 2050. The main option here is, of course, switching to lower carbon fuels, and I will get to that in a moment, but behavioral changes or avoid shift measures that reduce demand can also play a role in decarbonizing the transport sector. In aviation in particular, regional flights can be replaced with high-speed rail. Overall, our assessment is that such behavioral changes can reduce aviation demand by 20% in our scenario. So reducing demand for travel is very important, but you cannot achieve climate goals without changing the fuel sources that we rely on in transport. Today, 90% of transport fuel use globally is oil. If you want to reach net zero emissions by 2050 for the entire energy sector as a whole, then transport reliance on oil must fall to only 10%. The type of fuels that are going to be used are different depending on the transport subsector. Electric cars, I already mentioned them, are most ready to decarbonize passenger transport, and so in our scenario, 90% of energy demand by 2050 is from electricity in a net zero by 2050 pathway. For heavy trucks, the race between technologies is still somewhat more open. There has been a head start for electric trucks, of course, and so over 55% of energy demand in that scenario is from electricity. But long-haul, heavy-duty trucking is harder to electrify in some ways, and so in our analysis, hydrogen still meets about 1/4 of energy demand in that particular pathway. In aviation, emissions are somewhat hardest to abate. Given the specific fuel density requirements, they are very high, and so sustainable drop-in biofuels are an important option here, meeting 1/3 of energy demand in a net zero by 2050 compliance scenario, but there are limits to sustainable biomass production. In a low-carbon world, everyone wants to have bioenergy, sustainable bioenergy, but we only have as much. So we need to be realistic about what we can achieve there in terms of scale. Aviation is a key sector for biofuels, but hydrogen-based fuels, such as synthetic aviation fuels, can also play an important role. In our scenario, they meet 45% of aviation energy demand by 2050. And then there's shipping, where hydrogen-based fuels, in particular ammonia, take a leading role in decarbonizing the shipping sector. They represent over 60% of shipping energy demand by 2050, biofuels representing another 20%. As a final point that I would like to make a point about recognizing the importance of innovation, in particular I mean, it's true for all of energy, to be honest. And no matter if you look at the ways we produce energy, the way we consume energy, innovation is always important. Not only to bring technologies into the market, but also to continue innovation as the technology is in the market, because cost reductions are not only achieved by scaling, but also by continuing innovation as we are having technologies in the marketplace. But for shipping and aviation, it is important to know that the road to decarbonization is still quite bumpy, if you allow me that kind of analogy. The technologies and fuels that are needed for deep emission cuts are simply not yet market ready. We need significant levels of technology innovation for shipping and aviation in particular. We've seen great progress here over the past few years, as reflected on this slide, about what we refer to as technology readiness. but more will be needed in order to scale up the production and use of low-emission fuels for shipping and aviation. For example, in September this year, Maersk launched the first container ship running on biomethanol, and just last week, Wärtsilä announced the first commercially available dual-fuel engine capable of running on ammonia. Is not reflected in this figure here, but it's a very important step. Such ammonia fuel engines need to be successfully deployed on board vessels already this decade. For aviation, scaling up synthetic fuel production is absolutely critical. For further technology development is needed here, in particular to improve the efficiency and reduce the costs associated with synthetic fuel production. Commercial scale production of synthetic fuels for aviation is needed by the 2030s. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for aviation to play its role. But all that doesn't mean, it really doesn't mean that we can wait with the decarbonization of shipping and aviation. Because technologies are not there for deep emission cuts doesn't mean we can wait. They are not off the hook for decarbonization. In fact, no sector can escape the need for cutting emissions drastically for the world to achieve 1.5 degrees. It means for these sectors doubling down on innovation and deployment efforts as the keys to success. With that, thank you very much for your attention and for inviting me to today's conference. I wish you really productive 2 days. Thank you very much.